They never found the bodies, just 63 stakes numbered in black ink driven into the frozen Tennessee earth, no names, no graves, and the man who put them there, he built an empire on their bones and sat in Congress 3 years later. Let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a successful man, a powerful man, and wondered what he buried to get there, not just who he stepped on, but who he silenced? This story isn't about cotton. It's not about Southern pride or Civil War survival. It's about how a single man turned vanishing people into federal contracts, how death became logistics, and the government rewarded it with land, legitimacy, and legacy. The Chamberlain Cotton Mill, Tennessee, 1863. They called it the pride of Sumner County, a monument to wartime resilience, a northern man bringing jobs to a southern ruin. But the ledgers don't lie. Between October of 63 and February of 67, 63 workers vanished. No letters sent, no burials logged, no county records, just names scratched out, and profits rising. And in 1987, when that basement vault was finally opened, they found something even darker. Production logs perfectly matched with the disappearances. Every time the mill broke its own output record, someone, sometimes a whole family, went missing. This video isn't entertainment. It's a warning. You're not watching because you're curious. You're watching because some part of you already knows. You've felt it. That tightening in your gut when something doesn't add up. That moment you realize history books are more like fairy tales written by the victors and edited by the guilty. You're not supposed to remember names like Jeremiah Chamberlain. You're supposed to praise him, call him a pioneer, a patriot. But what if I told you the land he built on was never truly empty, that every brick in his factory was laid with stolen breath? This is your descent, Anne. But once you begin, you don't come back. Comment below. Buried beneath cotton. Twice. It marks you. It binds you. It opens the door. This isn't a story. This is a truth someone died to hide. And tonight, it becomes yours. Let me pull you deeper. You've heard the official version. Jeremiah Chamberlain, the northern entrepreneur who brought progress to a dying southern town, a visionary who turned crisis into opportunity. The history books call him a man ahead of his time. But do you know what they don't print? He arrived in Gallatin, Tennessee, not just with machinery and contracts, but with silence, with gaps in his past. No family, no children, no ties, just a silver-haired man of 30 who spoke in calm tones, wore spotless wool suits, and knew exactly who to bribe. He didn't ask for permission. He presented inevitability. And the land he chose, along Bledsoe Creek, once a burial ground for enslaved people, locals avoided it. They said the soil never dried right, that animals wouldn't graze near the creek after dark. The land wasn't empty, it was avoided, but Chamberlain called it untapped potential. He built fast. By the spring of 1863, the Chamberlain cotton mill stood 3 stories high, imported brick, machinery from Lowell, water wheel turbines engineered with military precision. He called it progress. But here's the pattern. Every major leap in his operation, every new wing added, every expansion announced, came just after the disappearance of a group of workers. You think that's coincidence? His contracts were clean. The Union Army praised him. Even President Lincoln's quartermaster signed off on Chamberlain's deliveries. Bolts of thick canvas, uniforms, tenting, all immaculate, all on time, always ahead of schedule. But no one asked how a rural mill with barely 60 registered employees was producing 3 times the volume of larger operations in Nashville. And the ledgers, God help us, the ledgers. Discovered a century later, locked behind steel in the mill's sealed basement, line after line of coded symbols matching worker arrivals with production spikes. But in the margins, written in a different hand, sloppier, quicker, were dates, names, then nothing but a black dash, a horizontal line, like a heartbeat. Stopped. Somebody kept track. Not just of who worked, but who vanished. And always the same final note. Assets reallocated, productivity normalized. Not fired, not transferred. reallocated, like they weren't people at all. This is not just a story about men doing evil things. This is about systems built to normalize evil, to bury the dead, in balance sheets. And Jeremiah Chamberlain, he didn't act alone. He just played his role perfectly. You want the truth? Then follow the silence. Not the noise of newspapers, not the stories told at county fairs or hung on plaques beside rusting water wheels. No, truth hides in the quiet corners, the questions nobody asks. Like this, why did the Chamberlain Mill never report a single workplace injury between 1863 and 1867? Cotton mills were brutal places. Even the best-run operations mangled fingers, tore flesh, snapped spines. Children lost limbs cleaning under gins. Women caught their hair in belt drives. Blood was the price of progress. But not here. Dr. Marcus Henley, Gallatin's only physician, once confided to his wife, "I see injuries from every mill in the region, except Chamberlain's. Either he's a miracle worker or the injured never leave the property." And they didn't. Not alive, anyway. Let me show you something the history books didn't preserve. In 1871, after Chamberlain's death, his estate was inventoried by court-appointed agents. Among the possessions listed, a collection of anatomical reference books, most dating from German publishers, 11 sets of steel surgical instruments unused, and a cabinet marked specimens, contents sealed. That cabinet vanished from the record 2 days later. Removed. Not stolen. Removed. By request. This was never about cotton. Cotton was the surface story, the acceptable currency, but behind it was something colder, calculated. When a man begins to see people as numbers, when he learns how to turn flesh into value, that's when you stop calling it business and start calling it ritual. See, Chamberlain wasn't unique. He was efficient. He perfected a method that others flirted with. Take the poor, the desperate, the displaced. Offer hope, house them, work them, then erase them. The beauty of the system? The victims were already invisible. Refugees, orphans, freedmen, no property, no kin, no one to file a missing persons report. What he built wasn't just a mill, it was a machine, a system of extraction where cotton was the output, but the human soul was the fuel, and the county let it happen, because the payroll was fat, the taxes were timely, the mill fed the town's economy and its silence. This is how real power hides its crimes, in plain sight, in paperwork, in praise. So ask yourself, when was the last time you read a plaque on an old building and wondered what had to die to make it worthy of bronze? By the fall of 1864, the Union Army was tightening its grip across Tennessee. Towns were being burned, plantations emptied, owners fled. But the Chamberlain Mill, it thrived. No disruption, no raids, no burned bales. It was as if the blue coats avoided it, or more accurately, were told to. See, Elias Chamberlain wasn't merely a cotton man. He was a financial conduit, a bridge between southern soil and northern wallets. And during wartime, cotton wasn't just a crop. It was currency, essential to the war machine. Northern textile barons needed it. Union generals needed the profits to fund rations, uniforms, bullets. And Elias? He knew it. He made himself indispensable. There's a letter, archived but never publicized, between Union General Lovell Rousseau and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, dated November 1864. In it, Rousseau writes, "The Chamberlain operation is critical, disruption inadvisable, local instability minimal, recommend non-interference." That's not protection, that's collusion, that's a wartime contract signed in silence, brokered through blood-soaked cotton. You need to understand this. When someone becomes too useful to be questioned, they become too dangerous to be accountable. That's when the murders begin, quietly, not with screams, not with gunshots, but with disappearing faces. A boy named Horace was the first, just 11 years old, freed from a plantation near Murfreesboro, taken in by the Chamberlain estate, along with dozens of others. One night he fell from the gin platform, broke his leg in 2 places. He was never seen again. The overseer's ledger listed him simply as no longer in service, injury, no burial, no hospital, just erased. Weeks later, 2 more boys vanished after an overnight shift. No weather reported, no incident filed. Gone. And then there was Sally, a 17-year-old laborer. Hard-working, vocal, too vocal. She complained about the food, the sleeping quarters, the punishments, and then she vanished. Some said she escaped, but those who knew her knew better. They said her last words were whispered in the dark. They don't want us to leave because they can't let us talk. And that's when it started to click. This wasn't neglect. This was containment. Deliberate, systematic, ruthless. Elias Chamberlain didn't run a mill. He ran a harvest of silence, of secrecy, of souls, and the scariest part? The town thanked him for it. In January of 1865, a man named Reverend Ezra Callahan arrived in Duskmore. He was an abolitionist preacher from Pennsylvania, known for his fiery sermons and refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice. Local legend says he came uninvited, sent by a northern religious organization to inspect moral conditions on Tennessee plantations that had supposedly freed their laborers. But when Reverend Callahan stepped foot on Chamberlain land, something changed in him. At first he did what reformers did, asked questions, held prayer gatherings, took names. He spoke with the boys and girls Elias had taken in, orphans, runaways, freedmen. But what he found wasn't freedom, it was fear. Deep, choking fear in their throats, like their lungs forgot how to speak without permission. He wrote in his journal, "They smile with dead eyes. They pray like it's their only weapon. Something here walks beside them, and it isn't Christ." And then he stopped writing altogether. 3 weeks after his arrival, the Reverend was found in the millhouse cellar, his neck snapped, eyes wide open, Bible clutched in one hand, a broken comb in the other. Sheriff Montclair ruled it an accident, claimed he fell during prayer. No investigation, no funeral. The townsfolk whispered, of course. Some said Reverend Callahan was trying to take 3 children with him to safety. That Elias found out. Others swore they heard screaming that night, not from Callahan but from a girl. And when they tried to look for her, they were told there was no girl. But the old grocer swore he saw Callahan hand her a coat and a locket the day before he died. And here's the damning part. That very locket, silver, with a blue ribbon, was found buried in the orchard behind the main house in 1923, still closed, still unclaimed. Inside, a torn paper scrap that read, "If he sees you, run. If he touches you, you disappear." Now ask yourself, how many more warnings are buried out there? Because that locket wasn't an heirloom, it was evidence, and whoever buried it didn't expect it to survive the decades. But truth has a way of clawing its way back through soil, blood, and bone. And in Duskmore, Tennessee, the ground never forgets. There's a word that keeps appearing in the fragments of forgotten letters, burned ledgers and whispered confessions tied to the Chamberlain land. The shed. Not the mill, not the house, not the cotton fields. The shed. Built behind the western grove, fenced with rusted iron, not on any blueprint, no records of construction, not even locals remembered seeing it rise. It just appeared. And those who saw it up close claimed it was older than the Chamberlain estate itself, older than Elias, older than Tennessee. The strange part? Children disappeared near it. Always children. They were sent to deliver food, bring tools, fetch blankets, and were never seen again. But the most chilling account comes from Mary Liddell, a 14-year-old cook's assistant in 1865. She survived, barely. She escaped Duskmore in the middle of the night, barefoot and bleeding, after hiding beneath a wagon for 2 days. She was found near the Cumberland River, dehydrated and incoherent. The nurse who treated her kept a journal of their conversations. In it, she wrote, "Mary said they took her to the shed after she asked about her brother. She said the inside didn't match the outside, that it was bigger on the inside, that the walls were made of skin. Let that sit with you. Walls made of skin." When asked whose skin, Mary broke down. She screamed one word again and again. Numbers. The nurse thought she meant days, until she realized Mary was trying to say names, that the walls were labeled, every patch had a number, and those numbers matched the stakes later found in 1983. The horror here isn't just murder, it's ritual, a pattern, a system. The shed wasn't storage, it was a machine, a chamber where people went in and didn't come out whole, if at all. And here's what chills me more than any of that. When Chamberlain's grandson died in 1951, the family held a private estate sale. On the items sold to a wealthy collector was a leather-bound manual labeled Storage Protocols, Class C Labor. The collector, he vanished. 2 months later, his body was found in an abandoned train car outside Memphis, missing skin from his back. Guess what was carved there? C-17. And just like that, the past wasn't the past anymore. The deeper you dig into the Chamberlain archives, the more the dates stop making sense. Take Dr. Horace Bellamy, for example, a physician from Georgia who moved to Duskmore in the summer of 1866. According to town records, he was employed as the estate physician for less than a year. He was young, Harvard-educated, and deeply committed to modern science. But something broke him in Duskmore. He arrived preaching cleanliness and germ theory. He left raving about things that lived beneath the house, things that could not be killed, only appeased. His private correspondence, uncovered in 1979 in an attic in Savannah, included a sealed letter never meant to be mailed. The letter was addressed to "Whoever finds this after I'm gone." Inside, in smeared ink and frantic script, he wrote, "They are not ghosts, they are echoes, alive and aware. The Chamberlains have fed them long enough to give them memory. You cannot burn what remembers its shape. Let that settle." He claimed that beneath the foundation of the main house, there was an older structure, something built long before the plantation, a kind of chamber, bricked over, forgotten, until Elias found it. Bellamy was eventually dismissed after he tried to burn part of the orchard. The town called it madness. But later that year, 2 sharecroppers unearthed a partial skeleton wrapped in decaying velvet beneath the same scorched patch of earth. The bones were fused together, fingers to jaw, vertebrae to ribs, as if the body had folded into itself in agony. Bellamy vanished on his journey back to Georgia. His carriage was found on the edge of the swamp. His shoes, his coat, and a stack of journals were still inside, but no blood. No signs of struggle, just one word burned into the leather seat with acid: witness. Ask yourself, what did Bellamy see that turned a man of medicine into a prophet of terror? And why did the Chamberlains let him leave, but made sure his warning would never spread? Or maybe he didn't leave at all. Maybe what walked out of Duskmore wearing his face wasn't entirely Bellamy anymore. Because the Chamberlain land doesn't just break bodies, it absorbs them, and some things return in pieces. There's a missing page from the Duskmore estate inventory dated October the 4th, 1863. On the surface, it's just a shipping log, listing cotton bales, crates of tobacco, sacks of grain. But if you look closely, the entry numbers skip. Items 202 to 207 are missing, not scratched out, completely absent, like they were never written at all. For decades, no one questioned it, until a historian named Alan Mercer cross-referenced the Chamberlain logbooks with records from a nearby Confederate depot, and there, buried in the quartermaster's receipts, were 5 sealed containers labeled simply, "Live Holdings, Special Class." No weights listed, no destination, just one note scrawled at the bottom: "Keep cool. Do not open near trees." Let that sink in. Do not open near trees. What the hell was inside those crates? The only other clue comes from a faded report signed by a Captain Elias Horn. He escorted the shipment to a secured holding near Jackson and was reportedly found 2 weeks later, blind, rambling, with his mouth sewn shut, using horsehair. His final message scratched into a barn wall with broken fingernails: "They don't breathe, but they know your name." This is where the timeline fractures. After this incident, Duskmore records get increasingly erratic. Wages paid in silence credits, workers categorized as non-returnables. One ledger lists the Chamberlain children's toys as interchangeable, Not wooden horses, not dolls, just interchangeable. By 1864, 3 of the 6 Chamberlain grandchildren vanished without obituary or ceremony. The family insisted they were sent to boarding schools in England, but no schools ever confirmed enrollment. In a chilling letter to his cousin in New Orleans, Elias Chamberlain writes, "We've made the necessary adjustments. What's left of the boys is useful. What's left of the girls is listening." He signed it not as Elias, but with a single letter, C, not EC, like a classification, a rank, like he'd become part of the system he'd built. Or worse, something else had taken his place. Because somewhere between the missing shipping crates and the children who stopped blinking in photographs, Duskmore stopped being a plantation and became a gate. By 1865, the Chamberlain estate had become unnaturally quiet. The war was ending, the Confederacy crumbling, but Duskmore remained untouched. No Union patrols crossed its border, no fires, no raids, not a single soldier dared step foot on Chamberlain soil. Why? Because by then the stories had already started spreading, not just among workers, but between regiments, whispered over campfires like curses. Stories of a lightless fog that swallowed men whole, of voices calling from the cotton rows in the voices of dead loved ones, of trees that bled when struck with an axe. But most terrifying of all were the mimics. That's what the workers called them. Things that looked like Chamberlains, but weren't. Servants swore they'd seen Elias eating alone in the dining hall, then again in the garden 5 minutes later. Same coat, same scar, same voice, but different eyes, dead eyes. One slave girl, Sarah May, escaped to a Union outpost. She was half-starved and barely conscious, but she kept repeating one phrase before she passed. He watches from below, but now he wears Elias like Sunday clothes. Her testimony was filed away in a military archive labeled Delirium, but the report was tagged with a crimson wax seal, an old Southern sigil not used by the army, one that matched the Chamberlain family crest. Meanwhile, plantation maps were being altered in Washington. Duskmore was redrawn, not as private property but as restricted terrain. No explanation, just thick black lines and silence. Even the railway was diverted to avoid the land. Why? Because strange things were being dug up. One freight operator described bundles of hair tied with iron wire buried beneath mile marker 6. Another found a set of infant bones with adult-sized teeth beneath the orchard path. And always the same pattern. Dig too deep, and something follows you home. And perhaps the most disturbing part. The Chamberlains didn't try to hide it. They documented it, catalogued it, welcomed it, as if they were breeding the land, refining it, feeding it with blood, loss, and memory until it no longer grew cotton, but obedience. And from that obedience came control, not just over the estate, but over minds, movements, even identity itself, because the soil wasn't cursed, it was programmed. And the Chamberlains, they were just its first priests. In the Chamberlain Manor's 3rd floor, far beyond the master bedrooms and guest parlours, was a locked room that no servant dared approach after nightfall. It had no number, no windows. Just a blackened door, reinforced with wrought iron and engraved with markings that didn't match any known language. They curled like veins, as if the door itself were alive, growing. Most believed the room didn't open. But once every few weeks, Elias would vanish for hours. No witnesses, no footsteps. Then he'd reappear, thinner, pale, and smiling like nothing happened. Some said the door only opened inward. Others whispered that it never closed at all. One night in October 1865, a young housemaid named Eliza broke rank. Driven by curiosity or madness, she placed her ear to the door. What she heard was not human. It sounded like a choir, 1,000 voices chanting in perfect harmony, but the words were reversed, as if time inside ran backward. Then, beneath that chant, a heartbeat, enormous, slow, hungry. Eliza never spoke again. She was found wandering the orchard at dawn, her mouth filled with soil, her tongue completely missing. After that, No one dared go near the third floor, except Elias and his brother Jeremiah. Ah yes, Jeremiah, the forgotten twin. While Elias smiled for photographs and gave speeches on Southern dignity, Jeremiah stayed behind the curtains, pale, expressionless, mute. Many believed he was simple-minded, a family shame. But those who caught glimpses of his eyes through the glass said otherwise. He wasn't watching you, one groundskeeper recalled. He was remembering you, like he'd already lived your death. In truth, Jeremiah was the Chamberlain family's recorder. He didn't speak because he wrote everything down, not on paper but on walls, inside that third-floor room, painted in lamb's blood, charcoal, bone dust. What did he write? Names, rituals. Family trees that went backward, from future descendants to ancient ancestors, like time spiraled instead of flowed, and always at the center, drawn again and again, was the root man. A tall figure, faceless, with limbs like tree branches and teeth like broken flint. Jeremiah didn't invent him, he remembered him, as if the Chamberlains hadn't just made a deal with something dark, but had always belonged to it. By 1867, the Chamberlain Cotton Empire had expanded well beyond Tennessee. New mills, new lands, and yet the family never celebrated publicly. No grand parties, no heirs married off, no appearances in Southern elite circles. Instead, the manor grew colder. Rooms were bricked off, curtains stayed drawn year-round. Workers noticed strange alterations in the fields, rows of cotton interrupted by spirals of dead soil no one could explain. Animals refused to go near them. But Elias was changing too. He no longer visited the fields. He stopped eating meat. He drank only boiled rainwater collected in glass jugs marked with strange etchings that seemed to shimmer if you stared too long. The locals began calling him the Hollow Baron, behind his back, of course, because anyone who said it aloud near the estate vanished. Even the town's sheriff, Augustus Boyle, began asking questions. In July of that year, Boyle sent 2 deputies to the Chamberlain estate to investigate the disappearances of several freedmen hired to pick cotton near the West Orchard. They never returned. 3 days later, their horses showed up on the sheriff's lawn, skinless, still breathing, eyes wide open. Sheriff Boyle left town that very night. He never wore his badge again. His letter of resignation simply read, "They don't bury their dead. They feed them." Meanwhile, inside the manor, Jeremiah's room grew darker. One surviving maid reported that his walls, once covered in symbols, were now entirely black. He no longer used ink or bone dust. He wrote in mirror blood, scraped from Elias's own veins during their nightly family rituals. She described one of the last symbols he painted, an enormous spiral with a man inside, falling upward. Around him were mouths. No eyes, no limbs, just mouths, and one phrase repeated all around the border, written in 7 languages, including 2T, hat don't exist. That phrase, the root demands memory. That was the family's code, a vow, a warning, because the Chamberlains didn't just offer blood, they offered remembrance. Every name written, every body buried, every truth hidden. All of it fed the root man, not just with flesh, but with story. Because in this family's twisted theology, to forget is mercy, and mercy is treason. By the winter of 1867, silence had consumed the land surrounding the Chamberlain estate. Farms nearby stopped growing, birds no longer nested in the trees. A dense fog, unnatural, immovable, hugged the ground every morning like a shroud. Locals whispered that it was not weather, but memory made physical, the grief of the unburied seeping from the unmarked graves. Inside the house, Jeremiah Chamberlain had become unrecognizable. No longer a child, not even human. A pastor who was briefly allowed inside to deliver winter bread described him as a thing wrapped in skin, not born but constructed. His face was wet with symbols. His mouth spoke in reverse Latin, and when I blinked, I saw two boys, one alive and one stillborn, trading places in the reflection of the window. He fled the manor and never returned. 3 weeks later, his church mysteriously burned to the ground. No fire spread, no lightning strike, just cinders where God used to live. Meanwhile, Elias Chamberlain had begun writing letters, hundreds of them, addressed not to family, not to friends, but to names not found in any census, written in glyphs that moved when not directly observed. The letters always included a single phrase: payment accepted, seed recognized. And in the plantation fields, men kept disappearing. Even the sharecroppers, brought in under false promises of wealth, began refusing to work past dusk. They claimed they heard children crying beneath the soil, voices asking to be remembered, but when they tried to dig, nothing, just cotton, always more cotton. Endless rows of pale, bone-colored stalks, too pale. In fact, a northern scientist, curious about the farm's booming yield, snuck onto the land and took a sample. He never published his findings, but his notebook was recovered years later. One line stood out, underlined 3 times. "This is not cotton, this is hair." The Chams. Burlane fortune was no longer fed by sunlight and soil. It grew from something deeper: memory, grief, sacrifice, a covenant between the living and something beneath them. And Jeremiah was now its voice. A child not meant to thrive, raised not to live, but to remember, for them. By early 1868, the Chamberlain estate had become more than just a plantation. It had become a site of pilgrimage for men whose names were never spoken aloud. Horse-drawn carriages with covered windows arrived in the dead of night. Figures cloaked in black stepped out, clutching odd briefcases, scrolls, and objects that hummed when touched. No one saw them enter the house. No one saw them leave. But Elias Chamberlain's study, once filled with ledgers and land deeds, was now a circle of salt and iron, lined with mirrors facing inward. Each mirror held a reflection, but none matched the viewer. It was no longer business. It was ritual. One night, according to an enslaved servant who escaped and fled to Illinois, Elias gathered 12 of these men in the old tobacco-drying barn. Jeremiah stood in the center, now taller, pale as milk, his eyes void of childhood. Elias placed a book bound in skin before the group. He called it The Ledger of the Unremembered. They read aloud. Each line was in a different tongue, some ancient, others never before written. But every man bled from the nose and ears as they recited, and Jeremiah smiled. He wasn't reciting, he was feeding. What they summoned that night has no name in any scripture. The next morning, 7 of those 12 men were found lying in the cotton fields, smiling, eyes burnt out, hands clutching the earth like they were being pulled into it, their bodies decayed twice as fast as nature allows. But the Chamberlain wealth tripled. Railroad contracts appeared out of nowhere. Northern investors, some linked to secret banking cabals, funneled gold into the estate. Confederate and Union spies alike kept their distance, warned off by dreams of a boy with black veins and no face. And Jeremiah? He stopped aging. Photographs from that year show the same blank-eyed child standing beside Elias, unchanged, timeless, a ghost wrapped in a child's skin. People in town began to mutter that Elias wasn't raising his son. He was guarding a gate. A gate paid for in blood, opened with sorrow, and guarded by a child who no longer remembered his name, only the names of the 63 buried below. By autumn of 1868, the Chamberlain plantation no longer echoed with the sounds of cotton picking or hammering rails. It throbbed with an unnatural silence broken only by laughter that didn't come from mouths. Visitors to the estate would report the same unsettling experience. As they approached the wrought-iron gates, a wave of nausea would wash over them, followed by the sharp, sudden scent of rotting honeysuckle, a flower that hadn't grown on the land in decades. More chilling than that was what they saw. Jeremiah standing perfectly still in the upper window of the east wing, watching, always watching, his eyes not glowing but reflecting things that weren't visible in daylight. And those 63 unmarked graves, the cotton fields they were buried under, began to move. It started with subtle shifts, dirt mounds where none had been, then small skeletal fragments peeking through the soil, only to vanish the next morning as if swallowed back by the land. Elias denied everything. He'd even threatened workers for speaking about the unrest below, but the truth was impossible to bury. The soil in that part of Tennessee grew richer, blacker, unnaturally fertile. Crops surged in size and color, but anyone who consumed them became wrong. A boy from town who stole cottonseed from the Chamberlain land and planted it behind his family's cabin vanished 2 nights later. All that remained were his teeth in the garden, set in a perfect circle around a single flowering stalk. Local preachers called it a curse. Doctors claimed mass hysteria. But those close to the Chamberlain estate knew better. It wasn't just cursed land. It was consecrated to something else. A former Confederate scout, now turned drunk, attempted to sneak onto the property with a journal and a crucifix, swearing to expose the family's practices. He was found nailed to the barn door the next morning, not with spikes, but with roots twisted and barbed, grown through his palms as if the earth itself rejected his presence. Elias Chamberlain no longer entertained guests. He no longer smiled. And Jeremiah, he began speaking in dreams. Not his own. The townspeople no longer whispered about the plantation. They crossed the road when its boundary approached. Mothers told their children it was just a cotton field. But deep down they all knew something was still growing under that soil, and it wasn't cotton anymore. The year 1869 brought more than whispers. It brought death, again, and this time it came from within the Chamberlain house. The plantation's head maid, Miss Agatha, a formerly enslaved woman who chose to stay on after emancipation, was the only soul in the mansion allowed to speak freely to Jeremiah. She'd raised him, bathed him, soothed his fevers when even Elias wouldn't enter the boy's room. If there was anyone Jeremiah trusted, it was her. But one morning, she was found dead in the kitchen, slumped over the table. Her eyes were wide open, mouth sewn shut with cotton thread, like a rag doll. Her hands were blistered and blackened, as if scorched by fire, yet the stove was cold. No signs of struggle, no sounds in the night, just silence. Elias locked himself in his study for 4 straight days after her burial. No food, no light. Just the sound of him scratching at paper and whispering in a language no one recognized. Some say he'd finally cracked. Others say he was trying to bargain with whatever force he'd invoked years ago. And Jeremiah, he didn't cry, he didn't speak, but he began drawing. Whole walls of his bedroom were soon covered in charcoal sketches, not of people, not of fields, but doors. Wooden doors, stone doors, underground hatches, all cracked open just enough to show shadowy figures crawling out. In every drawing, a tall man with no eyes stood behind the door, arms stretched forward as if calling someone through. The terrifying part? Each of those drawings corresponded to real places around the plantation. Doors beneath the barn, the storm shelter, even the old chapel cellar, sealed since Elias's grandfather passed. No one could explain how Jeremiah knew of them. He'd never been allowed near most of those places. Yet when Elias finally opened one of the doors to prove it was all imagination, what he found broke him. A spiral staircase car, ved into the earth, slick with moisture and lined with symbols older than Christ, and at the bottom an altar made from bones, human bones, adult and child, arranged like teeth in a monstrous grin. Elias didn't speak for a month after that. The town's preacher tried to bless the house with oil and prayer. His body was discovered hanging upside down in the trees the next morning, his organs twisted into a crown around his head. By now, there was no more denying it. The Chamberlains hadn't just built their fortune on unmarked graves. They had turned those graves into a gate. After the preacher's death, a dense fog settled over the Chamberlain estate, a choking, sour mist that never lifted, no matter how bright the sun shone in the rest of Tennessee. Locals stopped coming near the property, not even for business, not even for money. Elias Chamberlain had officially become a man alone with his legacy of rot. But it wasn't the isolation that drove him mad, it was the sound. The bells. Small metallic bells began ringing at random hours of the night. Not from the church, not from a servant's hand. But deep beneath the floorboards of the mansion, they'd start soft, then build. 12 at a time, then stop. Always 12. At first, Elias tore the house apart looking for the source. He pried up floorboards, smashed through stone, even gutted the walls. But each time he got close, the sound would shift, like it was playing with him. On the 12th night, the bells rang longer, louder, unrelenting. And then Jeremiah disappeared. His room was empty, no signs of a struggle. The only thing left was a message scratched into the headboard in Jeremiah's childish hand. I followed the humming. He said I could leave if I rang the bell. Elias descended into the old spiral staircase again, alone. He took only a lantern, a Bible, and a rusted Colt revolver. What he found in that subterranean chamber was not his son. The altar had changed. Now, 63 skulls lined the walls, one for every worker buried unmarked in the fields above. But now they were cleaned, arranged, each with a strip of cotton placed between the teeth, like ceremonial silence. And in the center was a new bell, not old, not rusted, newly forged, with the initials J.C. carved in. Elias stared at it until the flame in his lantern sputtered and died. They say he screamed for 5 days straight underground. No food, no water, just screams that echoed through the soil. The fields turned blood. Back where his voice touched, crops withered. Cattle refused to enter the land. Even birds stopped flying over. When he finally emerged, if you can call it that, his hair was white, his eyes sunken, his voice gone. The once feared master of Chamberlain cotton wandered the halls like a shadow, muttering prayers that never made sense and burning Bibles as fast as he bought them. Whatever he saw down there, whatever came through that gate of bones and bells, it didn't take his son, it replaced him. By the winter of 1871, the Chamberlain estate had become a place that even the desperate avoided. Elias, once a feared Titan, now wandered barefoot through the frozen cotton fields, muttering in Latin, cutting his own palms, and sprinkling his blood along the edges of the property. Locals said it was to keep something in. But inside the manor, something far worse was stirring. Neighbors noticed the lights never went out in Jeremiah's old room. The shutters were always bolted shut, but soft tapping could be heard from the window panes at exactly 3:13 a.m., even when no one was inside. Elias had sealed the door shut with melted wax and dozens of handwritten pages sewn together with black thread, pages torn from Bibles, medical journals, and anatomy diagrams. When asked why, he reportedly answered, "He keeps changing shapes, the boy. He wears my son's skin wrong." It wasn't long before those who dared to trespass, drifters, curious children, even bounty hunters, began to vanish. The only trace left behind, one shoe, always facing toward the manor, always placed with surgical precision on the path just beyond the orchard. Rumors began to swirl that Elias had created a mirror church beneath the house, a reversed version of the old chapel where nothing was holy and every prayer invoked something that should never be named. They said the altar held not a cross but a mirror, tall, gilded, and cracked across the center like a lightning bolt frozen in time. Witnesses, what few remained, claimed they heard children's laughter coming from below the floorboards, but never the same voice twice. Then came the Day of Screaming Frost, January 6, 1872. Without warning, the entire Chamberlain property froze, a radius of nearly half a mile. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight, wells cracked, trees split open and bled sap like open wounds. And at the center of it all, Elias Chamberlain, standing naked in the cotton field, laughing hysterically as blood poured from his ears. He died that day, but not from exposure. The coroner listed the cause of death as auditory rupture induced by sustained psychological collapse. But what truly disturbed him were the last words carved into Elias's chest, letter by letter, like a message for whoever would find him. He's not done with this soil. The blood feeds him, the bells awaken him, the cotton binds him, and then silence. but only for a while. The manor stood silent for nearly a decade after Elias's death. Silent, but not still. Locals say the soil never thawed where his body had been found. Every spring, the cotton grew everywhere, except that patch of land. It remained black, cracked, and lifeless, but never dry. It wept. Moisture rose from it on moonless nights, thick like breath, even when the air was cold enough to kill cattle. Then, in 1881, the Chamberlain estate was sold, quietly without record, to a man named Orville Griggs, a banker from St. Louis with a limp and a fascination for hidden architecture. Griggs didn't renovate. He excavated. The very first night, neighbors claimed to hear metal dragging across stone beneath the earth. Griggs had brought with him a small crew, 5 men, and within a week, only one remained. The others had either disappeared or turned on each other. That one man, an ex-Confederate named Durham, would spend his final days at the Nashville State Asylum. According to records now locked under restricted access, he carved a single word into his cell wall 117 times before his death: Chalkman. To this day, no one knows what it means. But the children in Fayetteville tell stories of a thin, bone-white figure who walks the rows of cotton, dragging a chalkboard behind him, writing names that disappear the moment they're read. They say if he writes your name, you forget how to say it, and soon others forget too. That's how you're taken, not by force, but by erasure. Griggs was never seen again after the winter of 1882. His carriage was found turned over on the estate grounds, horses frozen mid-gallop, eyes wide, nostrils crusted with ice. The wheels were still spinning, and the mansion? The front door had been nailed shut from the inside. When the sheriff's men finally broke through, what they found was worse than abandonment. It was occupation. The floors were caked with H-prints that didn't match any known shoe or foot. Some had only 3 toes. Some were bare but seemed to bleed salt. Others weren't prints at all, but outlines, as if bodies had been pressed hard against the wood, then vanished. In the main parlor sat a chalkboard, cracked clean down the center. Written on it, over and over, was one phrase: not the boy, not the father, the one they buried standing up. And beneath it, in smeared white dust, he remembers what was taken. By the time the state of Tennessee took possession of the Chamberlain estate in 1893, it had long since been abandoned, at least by the living. What remained was a shell, a house with rotting bones, strange etchings under every windowsill, and the unmistakable stench of something long buried and recently awakened. But what the state didn't know, or chose to ignore, was that someone had sealed the basement shut with limestone and lead, a crude but ancient method of containment. And when construction workers arrived to convert the estate into a cotton museum, they were ordered to remove the barricade. That's when the smell returned, stronger than death, richer than decay. It seeped through the cracks. One man said it smelled like burnt sugar and rotted teeth. Another collapsed before they even reached the staircase, screaming about a mouth in the wall that wouldn't stop whispering. Only 2 men entered the basement that day. Neither made it back up. A third man, a surveyor named Eldon Pruitt, watched from above and kept a record in his journal. He never spoke about what he saw, but his writing told enough. His final entry, just 2 hours after the descent, read, "It wasn't a basement. It was a holding cell, and whatever was held there wasn't meant to be named." But it was named. Once, on a document smuggled from the Tennessee Historical Society in 1978. A declassified letter, unsigned, written in a trembling hand. In it, a witness detailed the Chamberlain's secret pact with an entity called the Unharrowed, not a ghost, not a demon, something older than scripture, older than gods. The Chamberlains didn't just exploit labor, they fed the land. The 63 unmarked graves, they weren't just burial plots, they were sacrifices, and one of them, just one, was different, dug deeper, wider, framed with 7 iron rods and a layer of crushed bone, buried standing up, as of whatever had been placed there, wasn't supposed to sleep. And according to local reports, each August, on the anniversary of Elias Chamberlain's death, the same patch of land bleeds, not red, not black, but white, like chalk dust soaked in brine. And on that day, no birds sing, No insects crawl, no wind moves, just the sound of dragging, and a whisper behind your left ear that says, "Remember the name you lost." There's a reason no one utters the name Chamberlain in Fayette County anymore. Not in public, not even in whispers, not because they fear the family, but because they fear what still belongs to them. See, the land didn't just absorb blood, it memorized it. And men like Elias Chamberlain didn't vanish. Men like that don't die. They disperse, like spores, like a sickness buried in the soil, waiting for the right conditions to return. The 63 unmarked graves were never documented by the state. No official ledger, no headstones, no service. And yet, each year, those who live near the ruins report the same thing. Cattle won't cross the property line. Children fall ill when playing too close. Tools rust overnight. And worst of all, some claim they see figures in white moving in slow, halting loops around the old foundation. Ghosts? Maybe. But the old farmers say it's something worse. They say the land is retelling its own story. Like a phonograph carved into dirt and bone, the Chamberlain cotton fields have become a loop, an echo chamber of pain, greed, and silence. And whoever walks across that ground hears it eventually, the rhythmic chop of cane blades, the moans of men bound by more than just chains, and above it all, the deep, hollow laughter of a man who believed he had mastered death. The state covered it up, of course, declared the land historically unstable, sealed the site, erected a plaque that simply reads, "In memory of the unnamed." But the plaque doesn't last. Every year it's replaced. Every year it's found cracked in half, as if by unseen hands. And those who've tried to speak the truth? Most have gone silent, moved, disappeared. One was found in Memphis with his tongue removed and a cotton boll stuffed in his throat. So ask yourself this: if nothing ever happened, why is so much effort made to erase it? This wasn't just a southern tragedy. This was a ritual, a method, a blueprint for hidden empires built on silence. And now you know. You can't unlearn it. But here's the thing. Knowledge is a door. And once it's opened, you'll start seeing these legacies everywhere. And the question will haunt you. How many fortunes were grown from unmarked graves? Now you know the truth behind the Chamberlain dynasty. But ask yourself this: if 63 unmarked graves could be buried beneath one family's cotton empire, how many more graves lie beneath the legacies we still celebrate today? How much of America's wealth was fertilized in silence, in suffering, and in shadows? This story isn't over. It never was. Because history doesn't sleep, it waits. And the soil always remembers.